Welcome to University Drive, your pathway to the transformational work of University of the Bahamas. Our mission is to advance and expand access to higher education, promote academic freedom, drive national development, and build character through teaching, learning, research, scholarship, and service. Our goal is to build a better Bahamas by shaping tomorrow's leaders today, finding solutions to challenges, and forging new opportunities for growth. University Drive, where faculty, staff, students, and alumni travel the road of progress together with you. And now, here's your host.
The Mangrove series takes a critical look at what it is we value as a Bahamian people and the risks that a changing climate poses to these treasures. The series was inspired by the mandate issued from that time, the Oral and Public History Institute of University of the Bahamas in 2012 to document and disseminate the Bahamian story in the face of generational demise and climate threats. In April 2019, Institute Director Dr. Tracy Thompson invited Bahamian climate adaptation expert and then visiting scholar at UB, Dr. Adele Thomas, to partner in developing the series. I joined the team in June of 2019. The series offers a platform for colleagues at University of the Bahamas and persons in the community to explore who we are, what we do, and what we have that is worth our working to preserve, and to offer suggestions about how we can safeguard our treasures. The series takes as its symbol the mangrove, whose structure represents the deep Bahamian roots that underpin our social, economic, and environmental stability and development. At the same time, the mangrove is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, with the potential for it to cease to exist as climate impacts intensify. Welcome to University Drive. I'm your host, Nikki Bowe, and my guests today are Dr. Adele Thomas and Dr. Tracy Thompson, the Mangrove series, and we're so excited to share this new work with you as we launch this series. Dr. Thompson and Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for joining me on University Drive.
Thank you, glad to be here.
You are very welcome. It's a pleasure.
So we are excited. We've been working very hard on this initiative for quite some time, and we are seeing its work come to fruition. And we are going to flood people's psyche with the Mangrove series. Ladies, where did this concept come from, and why was it so important for you to collaborate on this initiative? And people are thinking, okay, the Oral and Public History Institute and the Climate Change and Adaptation and Resiliency Center, Research Center, how do these two come together to form such a collaboration?
Well, what I can say about that, Nikki, is that in the early part of 2019, I was having some conversations about where the Institute was going and what priorities it wanted to embrace. We have an ongoing program of historical research, but the thought arose that perhaps it was important to reach out to the Bahamian public more aggressively than the Institute had been doing. What came to my mind was that the defining question of all generations of Bahamians who are alive today, the defining question that we face is, how shall we deal with the fact that our climate is changing in ways that pose a distinct threat to our heritage, our historical patrimony. And I thought that what the Institute ought to add to its existing body of work is a forum that would enable faculty and staff and administrators within the UB community, but also people in the wider community and ultimately others as well, to raise their voices around what it is that we need to protect as a people in the face of these risks. But as soon as all of these ideas began to crystallize in my mind, what also began to happen is that I realized that in no way could the Institute spearhead that kind of conversation without help. And it needed to be expert help, and it needed to be committed help. And the person who came to my mind as the ideal individual to join with me in driving such a conversation would be Dr. Thomas, because of her credentials, her training, her experience, her commitment to all things Bahamian. And so I reached out to her in April of 2019 to invite her to stand shoulder to shoulder with me, bringing her expertise and her passion to bear to mount and sustain this discussion. And so we talked, and then there were some gaps in practical terms in what we could do. So we said, we need another brain to join with us. We need another pair of hands. We need someone who can bridge that gap between ourselves and the community. And again, right away, a name came to mind, and that was yours, Nikki. And so then it was a matter of reaching out to you, and thankfully you were enthusiastic. You said right away, this is worth doing. How can I help? And so that is how the team came together in order to help us to prepare as a community to meet and ideally to surmount the challenge of climate change.
Dr. Thomas, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I would like to say I was quite pleased when Dr. Thompson approached me about this initiative. You know, as a climate change expert, people tend to just put you in an environmental box and think that you're just dealing with things that have to do with the environment. But I saw this opportunity to show how climate change affects all aspects of life and to highlight how climate change places at risk things that we value. And so, you know, this idea that Tracy came up with to connect with community, to connect with faculty and staff and students was brilliant and offered a way to increase the platform of climate change in a way that I wouldn't be able to do just on my own. So very happy that this has come together the way that it has.
So there are so many things you said. You know, when we think of climate change, and I think for a long time, we kind of didn't pay much attention to climate change, but Dorian came and all of a sudden climate change was a reality for all of us. When people were advocating on the other side of the globe, we were like, okay, climate change, they're advocates, but now it seems as though Bahamians are taking this so much more seriously. And you mentioned how climate change impacts so many aspects of our lives. Share with us some of those aspects that climate change impacts that will be a part of this Mangrove series that people may not ordinarily think about or consider, but is so real and important.
Sure. So before I get into the impacts, I just want to pick up on what you said about the increasing engagement, I think, of Bahamians with climate change. And I can definitely say that I have seen that. When I came back to Nassau after grad school in 2012, I was shocked really at the low levels of perception and awareness and engagement with climate change that I saw at home, because off in school, I learned that we are one of the top 10 most vulnerable countries in the entire world to climate change. And so when I came home, I was expecting that I would be, you know, involved in how are we going to adapt and how are we going to prepare for these impacts that we're facing. But instead, it was like, is that even real? Does that affect us? and it was quite shocking to me. And so really with Dorian, I think that was an eye opener for people to see, with their own eyes, just how hurricanes are changing. They are becoming more intense, and that was just a perfect example. But in addition to the intensity of hurricanes and storm surges becoming higher, there are lots of other impacts that we have to be aware of. One of the main things that we have to be concerned with is sea level rise. So we are a small, low-lying nation. Sea level rise has the potential to erode our shores, as we are already seeing, and actually to claim significant portions of land. So we would actually have large portions of our archipelago that would be underwater. And that, as you can imagine, affects everything. So your infrastructure is underwater, your home, your Grammy home, where your people are buried, all of that stuff is at risk, sea level rise. Other things that you may think are just associated with the environment, such as oceans becoming warmer or oceans becoming more acidic, that is directly tied to our biodiversity in the oceans, but also with our fisheries. So we depend on fisheries. We eat conch, we export lobster and other things. Those are going to be extremely impacted by climate change. And then just finally, tourism. We've seen the impacts of COVID on tourism. Climate change is going to make things worse. So the global flow of tourists are not going to be attracted to be coming to the Bahamas, where it's going to be hotter, where you're going to be having more impacts of these storms, where your beaches are going to be eroded. We're not going to have that same attractiveness that we enjoy now. And so climate change really is going to affect every aspect of life as we know it in the Bahamas. And that is why I'm so glad we have this series to highlight that.
Before you answer, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Thomas, you said something that just stood out to me, and I think it should stand out to every listener. And that is the Bahamas is in the top 10 most vulnerable countries in the world. You know how many countries are in the world?
Yes, it's so shocking that we are so vulnerable, but yet there's such low awareness and there's such low action. So this is one of the real reasons why I was so excited about this series, is to try to promote people to understand that and to start making changes themselves, but also advocate for change on a greater level.
Prior to last year, I mean, I guess we can't just say last year, because we've had some really bad hurricanes for quite some time. I would say for the past 5 years almost, since Joaquin and Matthew, we've seen the intensification of hurricanes. Were people thinking, when that statement was made, were people thinking that, okay, this is decades out or maybe even another generation away and not so immediate?
Yeah, so the climate science has been improving. So when we first started talking about climate change, we would use projections of the year 2100. So by 2100, you would see all these changes. But what we're finding as the science proves is that we are seeing these impacts now, and they are going to be escalating. So even by 2030, there are some areas of the Bahamas that are going to be completely flooded. By 2050, even more. So we have been, as the scientific community, as we get better with projections, have been trying to relate to people just how real and just how urgent it is. And then that's backed up by us actually seeing the impacts in real life now.
Dr. Thompson, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I'd like to just bring in an area of our lives, a dimension of our experience that people don't often associate with climate change. But I think what Dr. Thomas has just said will probably not make what I'm about to say, more accessible. We don't often link history and climate change, but when Dr. Thomas says our sea levels are rising, and here we are, a country whose highest point is not 500 feet above sea level, and so we can envision, as she has just said, areas of our country simply being underwater. What does that then say for the ability of future generations of Bahamians to reconstruct our past? there are so many aspects of our collective story that we have not yet touched, that we can still touch because we have the land to walk, and we can see features on the land, be it cemeteries, uh, homes, businesses. They may be in ruins or they may be intact, but they are there. We can see streets and alleys and pathways. We can use that landscape as a platform onto which we can build further information that we derive from talking with people who lived in our communities, from looking at their scrapbooks or their photo albums, family photo albums, or looking in their Bibles where they've inscribed some details of their lineage history. It may be a business which has some records, some receipts. May not be a lot of documentation, but there may be something. What happens when all of this is underwater? Just before this broadcast, I was walking an area called the Hilltop, which historians sometimes call Delancey Town. This is the area immediately west of Government House on Blue Hill Road. And it's not large. Let's say it's from Blue Hill Road to Nassau Street, and from West Hill Street, which is where the restaurant Graycliff is, to South Street, which is just one block south of Bethel Baptist Church and St. John's Native Baptist Church. I was participating in a tour being given by Mrs. Arlene Nash Ferguson, who is one of our foremost educators and cultural enthusiasts. And we spent maybe an hour and a half walking, and we only touched the surface of the history of a small part of that area. What happens now when a Mrs. Ferguson must leave the Bahamas because so much of our terrain is underwater? And what happens when the places that she is talking about are submerged? And when the photo albums and the office receipts and the scrapbooks are wet and unable to be reconstructed. Yes, it is true that with modern technology, and particularly the internet and digital technology, there's a lot that we can do now that we couldn't do even 25 years ago. You can connect with someone who is now living in Azerbaijan, though you may be living in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. So yes, technology can certainly help us to retain links, and so certainly social media can help us to maintain a conversation that's centered on our identity as Bahamians. But that is a poor substitute for actually having the land and being able to be together walking our land and walking the story that our land tells. So climate change poses an existential risk to our ability to create, or I should say extend, our understanding of our past, and to transmit that story on to our children in a way that is real and active and vibrant for them.
Dr. Thompson, you both said a whole lot, and I want to extract and touch on things that you both contribute during this show. Dr. Thomas, you said that the climate science is improving, and initially projections were about impacts in the year 2100, but now they're making accurate projections for as early as 2030. And you said that by 2030, some parts of our country could be completely flooded. what areas are we talking about? Are there islands, or are there just like, break that down for us so that we can have a better understanding and appreciation of not just what we're facing, but the urgency to act?
There have been improvements in being able to better pinpoint places that are going to be affected by flooding. And so what we're finding in the Bahamas is that our existing low-lying areas where we are already seeing coastal erosion, flooding is going to increase in those areas, and then those could be permanently underneath water. So, for instance, in Grand Bahama, in East End, those communities that were so devastated by Dorian, Queenstown, as my grandparents actually live, Sweetings Key, those areas, that is already an area that floods. That's already an area that is, a lot of mangroves already there. As sea levels rise, as hurricanes become more intense and storm surge increases, those areas are at high risk to being completely underwater in the near term, 2030 to 2050 timeline. And there are places like that throughout our archipelago, the low-lying areas where we are already seeing erosion, where you already have, the land is already mangrove and it's already part of the ocean, but as the ocean rises, it's going to reclaim that land. So it's throughout the archipelago. And there are maps that are out there. If you go to the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center, we have some links to some of the latest science that you can take a look at.
Oh, wow. Dr. Thompson, you talked about your experience about visiting the hilltop, which is known as Delancey Town. And I'm sure there are many other areas. I mean, my mom and I were talking today about Cat Island, where she was born and raised. And she said she remembered when the population of Cat Island was like so much, like it seemed as though it had such a robust population, and now there are so few people on the island, and those that remain are so old, and there are stories to be told. We hear about centenarians who are still of sound mind, but nobody's getting their stories. Why is it important for us to capture these stories? And you mentioned that we may be able to connect with people, and we ourselves may have to migrate. We may have to become climate refugees at some point, perhaps. If that is the case, then how do we retain our story and our history, and even in the midst of that, our culture?
I am a firm advocate of the need for us to mount a decisive, urgent intervention that takes the shape of assembling and training small teams of committed people who implant themselves, if they are not already in settlements across the archipelago. Some of them may be from those settlements, and others may be based elsewhere, and they come to the settlement. So as I see it, these teams would base themselves in either individual settlements or small clusters of settlements, and the teams would be equipped with all the recording technology that we have. They would be trained in how to properly use the technology. Just as much or even more, they would be trained in aspects of our history and our culture. And their job is to spend not months, but years, whatever time we still have, sitting on the porch, sitting indoors, sitting outdoors, sitting in the boat, climbing up the cave, whatever is needed in order to acquaint themselves with and record the experience of our elders. I'm talking people, let's say, who are probably going to be at least 60 years old, and more typically, let's say, 65 through, at the upper reach, you're probably saying around 95. So obviously the older, the better. But the task is to sit with those individuals and extract from them absolutely everything that we can in terms of their experience, what they can tell us that they recall of their own parents' experience. You know, what did they, let us say that this is an interview situation we're in now, and we have someone who is 100 years old with us. Let's talk about their life story, what they, their family environment that when they grew up, their parents' values, their parents' activities. Were the grandparents in the home? What can they tell us about their grandparents? Let's come to their own lives as children. How big was the family? Where did they go to school? What did they do when they weren't in school? What sort of recreational activities did they participate in? Who were the role models and the elders in the community, so that we understand what the ideals of people in the community were? What happened after they left school? Did they go to work? Did they continue their education? If they worked, at what? What opportunities were available to them at that time? How did their lives unfold over time? Did they marry? Did they have children? And on like that. What were those sayings that people had at the time that helped to make up the texture of our culture? How did they interact, they themselves and their parents and grandparents, with the environment? What is that medical knowledge associated with what we call bush medicine? What's that understanding of navigating by the stars, not using GPS devices? What's that folklore tradition that you know, is challenged by the ready access to other forms of storytelling that our young people now have? So this is not something that can be done in a month. It's not something that can be done in a year. It begins with establishing trusted relationships with people. That takes time. You will not have elders telling, you know, I wouldn't say confidential, but telling private aspects of their lives to complete strangers. You've got to build trust. That takes time. Then you've got to let people gradually share themselves with you. So we're talking that a given team might be in a community for 2 or 3 or 4 years. And it's at the end of that process that you have audio recordings, you have photographs, you have video recordings. You've got things that you've written down. You've got documents that they have allowed you to scan or photograph. Perhaps they've even entrusted the paper to you, but that's not necessary. They may just allow you to, you know, digitize, get a digital copy. You've got maps that you've drawn of the landscape and what's on the landscape, the built features, man-made, and the natural features where the trees were that the children knew about and used to climb and used to get their fruit from. So that sort of initiative, I call it an archipelagic expedition. It needs to happen now. It needs to happen on a significant enough scale to make the difference that we want to make. And after we have carried it out, we can talk about, okay, now what do we do with our data? But that comes after we have data to do something with. The priority is to have the conversations that allow us to agree that these are aspects of our story and our culture that are worth knowing. And now let us go and find out about these aspects of our history and our culture from the people who are still here with us to share it with us.
Well, that concludes our first segment here on University Drive. We take our first break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
To protect yourself and others from COVID-19, stay home as much as possible and avoid close contact with others. Wear a mask that covers your nose and mouth when you leave home. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds or use alcohol-based hand sanitizer. Practice social distancing. If you must leave home, stay at least 6 feet away from other people and disinfect items you must touch. Limit in-person contact as much as possible. To prevent the spread of COVID-19 if you're sick, avoid public transportation, ride-sharing, or taxis. Stay home if you're sick, except to get medical care. Remember to call ahead first. Separate yourself from other people and pets in your home. Everyone is at risk of getting COVID-19. Older adults and people of any age who have serious underlying medical conditions may be at higher risk for more severe illness. This message is brought to you by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and University of the Bahamas.
Welcome back to University Drive. I'm your host, Nikki Bowen. If you're just joining the show, my guests today are Dr. Adele Thomas and Dr. Tracy Thompson, and we are talking about the Mangrove series. It's a collaboration between the FDT, which is from that time the Oral and Public History Institute of the University of the Bahamas, and the Climate Change and Adaptation Resilience Research Center. And I know you're probably wondering, how does climate change and history come together? Well, that's what this show is all about, because a lot of times we don't see the connection between things, but Dorian taught us a whole lot. And if we don't preserve our history, climate change is going to come and take it all out. I mean, and even now in this era of COVID-19, where our lives have been completely disrupted, not even by climate change, but by the virus, we see the need to document things in a tangible way that cannot be destroyed, or if it is, there is still some archive of it, some trace of it, because those old photo albums, those old handwritten notes can be lost and destroyed and gone forever. Ladies, you chose, I guess we all did, we chose the mangrove. And Dr. Thomas, I'm going to ask you to speak to this, because you spoke about the fact that if these low-lying areas that constitute a lot of mangroves are at risk of being completely flooded in years to come, and not far away, you're saying 2030 to 2050, that's 10 years away. 2030 is 10 years away. What is the importance of the mangrove? And from I was in primary school, I've been hearing this word, mangrove, 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 protect the mangrove. Do we as Bahamians, I want you first to explain to us what a mangrove is, and do we really understand the importance of mangroves to our ecosystem?
The mangrove is incredibly important to our ecosystem. It's a tree that, it's right along the coastline. It can deal with the salt water and the brackish water. It's important in filtering water. It's important in protecting us against storms. So on shorelines where you have the mangrove, that breaks the wave energy from storm surge and high waves, and reduces erosion on the actual shore. It's an important place for biodiversity. That's where a lot of fish species procreate and are sheltered within those roots. So the mangrove is incredibly important and also incredibly vulnerable to change, particularly climate change. So mangroves, along with coral reefs, are one of the coastal ecosystems that is most at risk to climate change. As the oceans change, becoming warmer and more acidic, then mangroves are not able to keep up with those changes and may die off. And so the mangrove we chose as a symbol for this series because it shows resilience in that, it helps to protect. It's a safe haven for different species, but it is also quite vulnerable to climate change. Um, so, and then tangentially, I will say the mangrove, we may not actually know the importance of the mangroves. As I said, my grandparents lived in Sweetens Key on the east end of Grand Bahama, and their property was, on the water, but it was mangroves there. And they wanted to cut down the mangrove because they wanted a sandy beach. So they didn't want all of that muckiness that's associated with the mangrove, not understanding that that mangrove itself is providing protection against the water for their property. So I think there needs to be a greater recognition that mangroves are an important protective species for us, that we need to encourage mangroves staying in place and not cut them down, as we have seen time and time again when there's some type of development. The first thing is to clear mangroves and put, some type of sandy beach there instead. And my grandparents did not cut down that mangrove. I did not allow them to. And that actually saved some of their house, but not from Dorian, unfortunately.
Wow. You said you had a phrase, and your phrase was the mangrove is incredibly important and incredibly vulnerable. Dr. Thompson, our history, I see our history in the same way. Our history is incredibly important, but also incredibly vulnerable. Vulnerable for a number of reasons, not just from the threat of climate change, but vulnerable from the standpoint of us not properly documenting, or in the sense of attracting younger people to be drawn to taking a deeper and greater interest in becoming historians.
I would say that we do, for decades now, we have had historians, social historians, political historians, so generalists for the most part, who are professional and are in the academy or in other research-related institutions, who have been mapping aspects of our past, and I would say have been doing really an excellent job. The challenge has been that the cohort of those who are on the ground doing that within the country, and even if we add those who are based abroad, who are tackling aspects of our history, the cohort is too small. We have no less rich a past as any other community of people around the world, but we don't have tens of historians, much less hundreds, much less thousands. Even if we consider those who probe our past on an amateur basis, it's still a relatively small number of people. So the pace at which work can be done is quite limited. When you add the fact that there are bibliographic aids that librarians typically produce, indices, for example, to newspapers, or indices to collections of documents, that historians in major countries, let's say the United States, certainly Britain, use in order to accelerate the pace of their work. For the most part, Bahamian historians and others who study the Bahamas don't have those bibliographic aids, and so the pace of work is slowed even more. But you mentioned, do we have a challenge with attracting young people into becoming professional historians? And we most certainly do. Notwithstanding the fact that we have a strong bachelor's degree in history at University of the Bahamas, that does draw quite a number of students. Many of those students see their future in law or some other field, perhaps criminal justice, um, they don't see a pathway to becoming a professional historian and contributing definitively to the body of knowledge that the community of historians builds together. That may be changing as we're able to use social media more to, what's the word, to stimulate interest in our past among our young people. When the little video clips go out that talk about slavery in the Bahamas, and so it's a matter of listening to a 2-minute clip rather than reading a dusty tome of 100 pages, that is more engaging for children and young adolescents, and they can begin to think about history more. I think we will see more interest in the future, but at the moment, there's a dire need to bring more young people into the professional field. I think if we mount what I've called that archipelagic expedition and recruit sizable numbers of young people as well as older people to participate in that undertaking, I think we can see a significant expansion in our capacity to document our past.
Dr. Thomas, I'm going to throw something your way, piggybacking off what Dr. Thompson said in my question to her. Are we seeing enough environmental scientists and enough persons in that field to take us where we need to be so that we're not so heavily reliant on foreign experts, but having our own who would have a vested interest and helping us as Bahamians, not just from a technical standpoint, but also from the cultural aspect, because I think a lot of what we do is driven by our culture, people's understanding, people's readiness to respond and to accept things is cultural a lot of times as well. Are we preparing the next generation to deal with these issues that are going to confront us in the not so distant future?
Yes, I think that there are quite a lot of young Bahamians that are interested and passionate about climate change and about coming up with solutions and addressing the risks that we face. Since starting up the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center at the Carr Center, I have been approached by many young Bahamians, UB students, graduates of UB, graduates of colleges and universities from abroad that want to come back home. And they are excited to see, the steps that are beginning to be made in addressing climate change. I think what we lack is the national focus and making this a priority, which then also comes with funding. So it's one thing to start a research center, but to actually have the funding to be able to bring on researchers, train young, Bahamians, get them started on coming up with ways to deal with climate change in the different sectors and communities, that requires funding. And if we're not getting it from our national budgets, then we need to get it from international sources. But that is really spearheaded by us, our government taking a vested interest and investing in what we need to deal with the risks that we face.
Dorian was a wake-up call for all of us, and I think from a historical aspect, Dorian definitely went down in the history books, and it's something that will be referenced and talked about for generations to come, perhaps as one of the worst hurricanes to make landfall in the Bahamas. So there's no doubt that it will be documented historically. And then from the climate aspect, I'm sure people are studying or will study or have begun studying Dorian to figure out what we can expect in the future or what made Dorian so different. You said that in order for it, that it has to be a national priority and the funding has to be given. Do you think that we've learned any substantial lessons from Dorian? And when I say we, I mean our government. Is the government engaging the experts and the relevant stakeholders for us to chart the way forward to mitigate against some of the avoidable mishaps of Dorian?
I think we learned our lessons when it comes to hurricanes. So you can see the newly developed Ministry of Disaster Preparedness, etc. But like I said at the top of the hour, hurricanes is only one of the many different risks that climate change presents. And so I don't think that we have that overall view of all of the risks that climate change poses for us and the need to address all of them and not just hurricanes. I also, I think this whole COVID thing has really shifted all of our attention and resources to dealing with the pandemic. But in the meantime, climate change doesn't go away. So we need to find a way to deal with climate risk, to engage experts that we have in countries, and to provide a platform and a space so that we can bring on young researchers and young Bahamians so that we have that talented pool of resources to draw from. I still see, a reliance on international people coming in when we within the country know best what our context is, how we can best respond, etc. So I think we have a long ways to go. We have learned some lessons from Dorian as it comes to hurricanes, but we need to apply that same urgency to dealing with the other risks of climate change.
What are some of those other risks of climate change? You mentioned earlier on sea level rise, and I think for us, our reality and all we can see, the tangible for a lot of us are the hurricanes because it's big, it's huge, it impacts so many people. But like you said, there are other aspects.
Some of the other aspects of climate change, in addition to the hurricanes and the sea level rise, you have the changes in the ocean that are going to affect our fisheries. It's going to affect our coral reefs, which then in turn affects coastal erosion. We're going to see higher air temperatures, and you already see the heat that we deal with here during the summer. That affects what is our ability to provide electricity. You already see how we're unable to provide electricity with current temperatures. Even during this summer when the big hotels weren't open, we were unable to provide electricity that was needed. That's going to be made worse by there being hotter air temperatures overall. So there are lots of different impacts, and there really needs to be a holistic approach to dealing with climate change. There needs to be a national plan as to how we're going to deal with climate change. And even going back to hurricanes, we have seen, even with Ragged Island is still waiting to be rebuilt after Irma, which was now 3 years ago. Are we able to rebuild every community that is affected by a big hurricane coming through? Do we have the resources to do that? Do we need to start looking at, are we going to consolidate our communities into, from small communities into larger communities, and that way we have the resources to rebuild if that larger community is affected? These are real issues that we need to start thinking about and coming up with plans. As a nation, we're hit on average every 2 years by a hurricane. Are we able to rebuild after each one for each community? That's an immediate thing that we need to start thinking about.
Listen, this is startling because it's a reality, and pardon my ignorance, but you mentioned that hotter air temperatures are going to impact electricity generation. How and why? I mean, explain that to us, because I know that this summer, the heat index, I get the report from the Met Office every morning. I get the forecast. And this summer, the heat index was 100, 104, 109. And as much as I love summer, I couldn't even go outside because you went outside and it was so hot. I didn't even want to open my windows because the hot air rushes in the house and it stays there. I couldn't even take my baby outside to enjoy the sun. And you know, babies need vitamin D because it was so hot. How is this hotter air and hotter temperature going to affect electricity generation? And what does that mean for us as Bahamians?
So hotter ambient temperatures make transmission of electricity through the lines less efficient. And that is in a regularly functioning electrical system. As we are well aware, in Nassau at least, we do not have a regularly functioning electrical system. Our demand exceeds the supply of electricity with current temperatures. So imagine if our current supply of electricity is declining because temperatures are hotter outside, which makes the transmission harder, and your demand at the same time is increasing because it's hotter, and those who are able to afford to do so want to cut on their AC, want to cut on their fan. Imagine the blackout. Imagine having the hotels on in addition to Bahamian. I mean, we have experienced this last summer. Last summer, I think, was the worst summer that I had experienced in terms of blackouts. The rolling blackouts, the island-wide blackouts. We can expect to see more of that if we don't start making some changes, if we don't start moving to renewable energy on a large scale for New Providence. We can expect to see more of that.
Wow, that is interesting. Well, Dr. Thompson, I want to loop you back in on this conversation. Our history, and you are passionate about preserving our history, about the art of storytelling. It's been with us for as long as we've known ourselves. Bahamians have thrived on the art of storytelling. People would sit around the elders' feet and listen to them talk. And now I think more than ever with COVID, we've seen where people are now communicating more, and they may be communicating in a different way because it may be technologically driven, but the communication is taking place. What can we expect from this Mangrove series as it relates to the sharing of our stories? And when you conceptualize this project and this initiative, what is it that you're hoping to achieve?
There are certain things I'm actually not focused on in terms of what this series can achieve. And then there are other things that I think it can contribute to. I'm not really seeing this series as a space where our historical experience is communicated to a significant degree. There would be other vehicles like a Ramble Bahamas and all manner of other things that we can do to bring our stories to young and old people in collaboration with existing cultural institutions like the Antiquities, Monuments and Museums Corporation, the Department of Archives, but also institutions like the Broadcasting Corporation of the Bahamas. Where I see this series making an impact is in helping us as, first of all, an institution, the University of the Bahamas, and then a wider community. I see it helping us to focus attention on the question, what is it that we want to keep? And behind that, who is it that we want to be, given that our existence is becoming under increasing threat? And I see this series being a place where who is it we want to be? What is it that we want to keep? What is worth having? What is worth knowing? Where these questions can be debated, can be looked at from different angles by people, Bahamians and others who are at the institution and in the wider community of all ages, and we can orient our national conversation, gradually orient it to looking at these questions, because they inform everything else. If it's not worth keeping X, then we don't have to exert energy and commit resources to keeping it. But if it's worth keeping Y, then as a matter of public policy or as a matter of private priority, we need to dedicate resources there. We know from what Dr. Thomas has said that we're not in the old normal, we're in a new normal. That new normal is we need to be prepared for the worst, which is that we have no more country, as well as doing our best to reduce threats to that potential reality. Preparing for the worst means making hard choices. What are we really about? Who do we want to be about? What do we want to have? What do we want to keep? What do we want to know? It's driving that conversation that I think this series can achieve.
Thank you. Climate change and the risk that it poses to who we are as a country and our very existence here in the Bahamas. Well, that concludes this episode of University Drive. My guests today have been Dr. Adele Thomas and Dr. Tracy Thompson. And I want to leave you with this. We've been talking about the Mangrove series, and Dr. Thompson said this: the Mangrove series is really about helping UB and the wider community to focus attention on what it is that we want to be, that we want to keep. Who do we want to be, and what is worth having and what is worth knowing? And in preparing for our new normal that will come about as a result of climate change, being prepared for the worst while doing our best to reduce the threats of this potential reality. Ladies, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be a part of this collaboration, and thank you for being a part of this conversation today.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to my listening audience. Be sure to visit our website at www.ub.edu.bs for all the episodes of University Drive, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And be sure to join us same time, same radio station for another episode of University Drive. And to look out for the Mangrove series. It's coming your way, and you definitely want to follow us on social media and on the university's website as we bring to you stories about what it is that we value and is worth preserving in the midst of climate change. I'm your host, Nikki Bowe. Enjoy the remainder of your day.
University Drive is a production of the Office of University Relations and the Communications and Creative Arts Academic Unit at University of the Bahamas. All rights reserved.